Are we good?
Yes.
So let's begin. Tonight's author, she's a Stanford alumna. We'll forgive her for that, being in Southern California. She's the former editor of Rafu Shimpo newspaper. But since she's turned to fiction full-time 20 years ago, she's accumulated enough awards to fill a trophy case. Including she's won the Edgar Award and Publisher's Weekly Best Book of the Year through her Mouse Arai series. Not long ago, she took home a Mary Higgins Clark Award, which is pretty big as well, for her previous book, Clark and Division. She's published nonfiction books, Life After Manzanar, and the award-winning Terminal Island, Lost Communities of Los Angeles Harbor. In addition to all of her work, you can see her on the speaking circuit, participating in countless book panels and talks on incarceration camps. And she's even leading tours of Boyle Heights, which is the setting of her latest wonderful book, Evergreen. Kirkus Review, which is the Michelin rater of the literary world, gave it its prize star review, and it called it a thought-provoking noir with a searing period flavor. While admiring her work, I am grateful for all of her dedication to support the Japanese American community, which makes me proud and so pleased to welcome Naomi Hirahara. Welcome.
It's wonderful to be here. I love your bookstore. And so many friends from different parts of my life here. And some new friends too, which is nice.
You know, you come up here a lot, and I just want to know, how did you find Chaucer?
You know, I don't know if I was just searching for a bookstore. When did we first come to Chaucer's, Wes? We do come, I live in Pasadena, California. So oftentimes we just go up the coast, we stay in different places. And it could have been around the holidays we were here. I remember it was raining, like one of the times we came. And it was kind of nice. There was like a rainbow there, and then we found Chaucer's. And I can't remember how we know each other.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, do you know?
It must have been at some book signing in LA, like maybe at Japanese American National Museum or something like that. But I think I met you here once before I worked here too. So you were here for a few years. I've been here 5 years. So yeah, it always happens, you know, us JAs, we kind of stick together, us JA writers, we kind of stick together, and we kind of stalk each other. So we're you know, I'm an unashamed fanboy. So before you came, your parents came here. They came here from Hiroshima. You came here in 1960s, and I was wondering about, they're both Hiroshima bomb survivors.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if they ever really talked to you about that.
Actually, they did. My father was actually born in Watsonville. It's wrong in Wikipedia, and I just don't have the energy to correct it. But I should. But he was born in Watsonville, California, and then was taken to Hiroshima when he was a young boy.
Okay.
And it was precipitated by this weird thing. My great-grandfather got killed by a horse in Watsonville, and for some reason the family went to Hiroshima.
Okay.
And my mother is actually from Hiroshima, and her parents had a stationery store that was very close to the center. They call it the Hypo Center. And and then my mother actually was 8 years old, so they put children. They kind of knew that there might be some kind of bombings or some kind of military violence there because it's close to a naval base. So she stayed in a temple during the course of the war.
Okay.
But then after the bomb was dropped, unfortunately my grandfather was right in the center. There was some kind of bureaucratic problem. So he was supposed to be released. I mean, he was he was probably in his early 40s or 30s and had 3 children and still was drafted. He never fought overseas, and he was just trying to get released.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he was there when the bomb was dropped. And so, they didn't know what kind of bomb it was. So my grandmother brought my mother from the countryside, and they were actually looking through the rubble to try to. So you know, my mother has sustained a lot of trauma from
Yeah.
all that stuff, and but she's still alive. She's 87.
Wow.
She's amazing, and but I think that has affected me as an immigrant. I mean, I'm a child of an immigrant, and I'm very kind of protective of my mother, and I think that's kind of similar to this character Aki Ito
Okay.
in because her parents are immigrants as well. Yeah, so I think in that way I do connect with this character.
Well, we'll talk about Aki in the book in a sec, but after your parents came over, you were a writer even at a young age, right?
I always wanted to write books, but you know, I was one of those kids, and I know Karen's a writer. There's some writers here in this room, and you know, we went to the library. That's where we, you know, and we participated in the summer book club, and you know, went home with a stack of books. And so I think I was trying to learn about the outside world for my parents, so I could negotiate and interpret that for them. So, but I would write, so I love story. I would write a lot of stories with Southern characters. I had never spent any time in the South. But you know, I'm old, so Mom, Pa Kettle, and things like that. And I think some of it was because I was hearing non-standard English in these characters, a dialect, and that's what I heard. I didn't hear Southern dialect, but I heard my own dialect, my parents' dialect at home. So I kind of, that resonated with me. And now when I look back, I think, oh, I was trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
You know, like the English that I would hear at home was a little different than the English I would hear at school.
So language really appealed to you, just how people talk, different ways people spoke, and even at a young age, it's pretty remarkable. Of course, you went to Stanford, but you weren't going to study writing at Stanford. I think I read that you studied international relations, and so the writing wasn't really a career track for you when you got to college, was it?
No, I was very idealistic. I wanted to save the world, and I had intentions to work in this third world, and I actually spent one summer in Ghana, Africa, and I got every disease. I got hepatitis, I got malaria, I got shingles on my face, and the people there were going, Naomi, you know, if you want to help us kind of change America, you know. And then I started thinking, oh, maybe I could do more with my own ethnic identity.
Yeah.
Because I think I was kind of running from being Japanese. So there was a prominent Japanese studies professor, Daniel Okimoto, and I kind of changed my focus there. Yeah, and I thought I was going to be an international lawyer, but the problem is I don't like conflict. So it's like, that might not be a very good profession for me. And it was only until I spent a year in Japan, and that's when I really knew that I wanted to write. And I even wrote a short story in Japanese.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of us just say now when of a certain age that you really did run away from being Japanese. I didn't want to be Asian because I wanted to assimilate and be like a white kid. So it's really interesting that you say that, and thank you for sharing that. What part of Japan were you in, and what was the short story that you wrote?
It was in Tokyo, and I think it was Hitotsuki ni Ikai. I went to Miyagi. I went to a small island to do research off of Tokyo, and it was a volcanic island. And it was one of these things. It wasn't crime. It was just a slice of life, and they were like raking the seaweed for kanten to make that gelatin. And there was just something that evoked the past for me. So so I wrote something. I mean, I couldn't write it today, but at the time I wrote it.
Wow, you spent a year there then.
Yes.
And were you immersed in the language and everything?
Very much so. It was an intensive language program.
Yeah. But after you came back from that, I think you started a career in journalism. And how did that come about? You know, you want to save the world, but now you are doing something similar but different as well.
Well, I wasn't on the fast track. You know, usually, like people of our era, you know, you get that internship at the New York Times or the USA Today. I was not on the fast track to anything.
No.
So I was like, well, I want to write. and I had sent my short story to the Rafu Shimpo, which is a
Okay.
Japanese American daily.
It's about
It-
100-year-old paper. or
It's
something
been
like that.
around since 1903, and I, and they came back to me and they said, "Well, someone just left. Do you want to work here?" And I had been freelancing for different kind of publications,
Mhm.
and it was a type of situation that this was a time where we used checks more. And my employer at one of these magazines, they were kind of fly by night. They bounced my check, so
Oops.
all my other checks were
Yeah.
bounced. And I go,
Oh, man.
I need something stable. So even though I was not happy about working for like a Japanese American newspaper,
Mhm.
I went for it, and that was like the best decision that I ever made.
And that was the seed of your involvement in the community. over the
Exactly.
years, so.
Yeah.
But then how did you transition from news to fiction?
I was always going to UCLA Extension and
Mhm.
taking those classes. So I always kept it up. That was my goal.
Mhm.
I think when you talk to a lot of journalists, Karen, were you a former journalist too? I can't remember. You weren't a journalist.
I'm fascinated by what you're saying, Naomi.
Mhm.
But with journalists, at least back then, it's kind of changed. You're supposed to be more objective, and
Yeah.
so
Right.
that was hard for me because with novels and fiction, it's all about point of view. It's all about being subjective, But the good thing about being a journalist is we can meet our deadlines.
Yeah. That's true.
Meeting
Yeah.
the deadlines. So we don't wait. Sometimes early on in my career, people would ask me, well, how do you, what kind of music do you listen to? What does your desk look like? And it's like I'm driving my husband crazy because I have all these books and papers everywhere, and there's not a really great system.
Yeah.
Because most of it's in my head, and that's kind of what I learned. Yeah.
To help me understand, could you give approximate dates and years, timelines for like when you went to Stanford, when you went to Japan, when you went?
Do you
Sorry,
really
but-
want to date
Yeah.
me? I'm just
Well,
teasing
I
you.
just
We're
need
just
some
trying to get an
historical
overview.
Okay,
Right.
I'll give you the ugly numbers. So I was born in 1962. So I'm 60. How old am I? I'm 61 years old. So I graduated from South Pasadena High School with my friend here, Lisa Ishikawa, who teaches she's been teaching for 3 decades since it's numbers, at a kindergarten at Montecito. So I graduated in 79, and then I went to Stanford. I graduated in 1983. Then I went to the Inter-University Center in Tokyo, and then I came back and started working at Rafu in the 1980s. So you're probably thinking, who does she know? Yeah.
We'll get to audience questions in a little bit. But did your journalism inspire any of your fiction? As an ex-journalist for 2 decades, I had initially had a problem with editors with me wanting to clean up quotes to make people sound like they were, which is not ethical, of course.
Mhm.
But I always wanted to always face the challenge of telling the story and actually reporting what happened. And I was just wondering about you, in terms of your journalism. Were you inspired to write fiction, or?
It helped me contextualize and also understand. When I started working at the newspaper, it was the redress and reparations movement. So a lot of people, Nisei, some Issei even, were finally telling their story. It was highly emotional, like during some of those hearings. Actually, when I was the editor, it was more the payment of the reparations that were going on. So I had this wonderful vantage point of what was going on in the community. So I think it gave me things to write about.
Okay.
I'm not a poet, although I love poetry. I think my tendency is to kind of look at the outside world, and here some of it is history and kind of things that people don't know of,
Yeah.
and then kind of bring it to light. So.
Okay. Interesting. So your literary career spanned 20 years now, starting with Masarai series, Ellie Rush, Leilani Santiago, 3 different series, and now the Japantown Mystery series. Did you get ideas to do these series, or how did these ideas come about?
You know, some of it was actually commerce, to tell you honestly. Like, they call it orphaned when you lose your acquiring editor. And I lost my acquiring editor like maybe 8 times, 7
Yeah.
times.
Wow.
So when that happens, you don't have an advocate in the publishing
Yeah.
house. So sometimes that ended certain series. It's a very small community, so a lot of it's relationship driven. So like for instance, one of my editors for Masarai went to Penguin, and that's when I pitched the Ellie Rush Bicycle Cop. And one thing was I was kind of writing an amateur sleuth series is so difficult.
Yeah.
Because how can you justify why is this old gardener encountering all these dead bodies, At least with a bicycle cop, she's dealing with crime.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's why I, was dabbling and experimenting. Some things didn't work, to be perfectly honest. There's like a fan base for all of these things, but some of them didn't have enough of fan base to kind of
Okay.
continue, to be quite honest.
Okay. And then how did Japan towns, of course, are disappearing. There's only 4 left, 2 in LA, San Francisco, and San Jose. Is there some kind of determination to keep these kind of alive through your writing, through the Japantown series?
Well, I think a lot of things changed with Clark and Division, which was set in Chicago, and that was based on research I had done with my friend Heather Lindquist for the
Okay.
Manzanar historic site, because they would say, what would happen to these people after they were released? And so Chicago was definitely the #1 destination for them.
Okay.
And like before the war, there were 400 Japanese Americans. By the mid-40s, there were 20,000.
Wow.
And the first ones to come were young people.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, some of them, they partied, they got into trouble, and I came across like a report concerned about juvenile delinquency.
Okay.
So that, because I'm a crime novelist, that
Yeah.
piqued my interest. And because that generation, I can't talk to them anymore.
Yeah.
I had to use, my imagination
Yeah.
to kind of picture. So actually, the Japantown, my editor was saying, Naomi, people like series, so this is, I think, right before I turned in Evergreen. It'd be nice if we put some kind of tagline. And I told Juliet, my editor, I said, I think that Evergreen is, I view Clark and Division and Evergreen as bookends to the resettlement period. At that time I said, I don't plan on writing anymore
Okay.
from Aki's point of view.
Okay.
But in the third one I'm working on, it's going to be 1903 Pasadena,
Okay.
and I'm taking a character's father.
All right.
So it's going to be
Great.
linked stories in
Like
that
a
way.
prequel type of
Mhm,
thing. That's
mhm.
interesting. Aki Ito is the main character in these 2 books, and she's from Los Angeles, a place called Tropico, and then she went to Manzanar. But like a lot of Japanese Americans, like you said, young Japanese Americans in the 1942-43, they were allowed to leave camp. Many of them were incarcerated in camp, a lot of them, and they went to the Midwest. My uncle went to Cleveland. And I really like it because it's not a well-known thing in American history that all these Japanese Americans went there. And I was wondering, how you got that idea and to settle it in Chicago and in a setting like this.
Well, it was scary to set something in Chicago because I had not spent much time there. So I did a couple of research trips, but it turned out to be like the best decision I made, just because there's not that many stories set in the Midwest about
Yeah.
Japanese Americans, even though there's this rich history. So I think that's, Clark and Division did very well.
Yeah.
And I think for Midwestern readers, it was like, wow, this is a story that touches us.
Yeah.
And I had no idea, and so I think, and also what's nice is they're released from camp. So it's not like a confinement. I mean, in Clark and Division, I do talk about some of the confinement in Manzanar. But it was kind of, Clark and Division I wrote during the pandemic. So I kind of understood being confined.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
we were all confined. And then things opened up, and it's like you're not quite sure how to act out there, right? And I was thinking on one level, that's kind of how Aki is.
Okay.
You know, she's trying to negotiate this new world, and what happens to her is she's in the shadow of her older sister, Rose, and something terrible has happened to Rose, so it's up to Aki to figure things out and carry her parents through it.
While navigating a strange land that she doesn't know anything about in the Midwest, and like I said, Chicago is just, it wasn't like being in camp or the hype of being in California, you know, the nervousness and everything, but there was still a lot of tension in the Midwest at that time. And I wonder if you could speak to that tension a little bit that you built in Clarkton Division.
Well, there are things like, you know, certain, a Japanese body could not be buried at any, you know, cemetery. It could only be buried at this one Montrose cemetery that was owned by Germans, and there was some limitations for these folks. But on the other hand, Chicago was its own place. So there's another prominent character named Art Nakasone, and he's actually from Chicago. So it's kind of a nice contrast because his family did not have to relocate, you know. So they're kind of living, I mean, life. I mean, there's things they can't do, they can't meet like they used to, but for the most part, their world, you know, they're in the same house. Their world was not as disturbed as for Aki. So it's kind of a nice contrast.
I really like that because the dynamic between the two, they're from the same place, America, but they're from a different world.
Yeah.
Pretty much, so. Now we get to Evergreen, and that's post-war Los Angeles, 1946. Aki moves back to Los Angeles, and then. Can I say something?
Oh, you could, in general terms, sure.
Okay, something very tragic happens, and there are many possibilities of how this happened. And I want to know, was this ripped from the headlines?
Well, one issue that I'm dealing with in Evergreen, because Aki, she comes back, she's a nurse's aide at the Japanese hospital in this community called Boyle Heights, which is a working class neighborhood right next to downtown in Little Tokyo. But she's also coming back as a newlywed, and she's married to somebody who was with the 10442nd Regimental Combat Team. I don't know how many of you know. How many of you are familiar with that particular? Yeah, many of you are. So they were all Nisei, Japanese American, except for the officers. So he's still in Europe because there's a point system. You can't just, even though the war is over, they can't just come home. So she's waiting for her husband to return. But you know, when I was thinking about writing Evergreen, I didn't want to make Aki like this amateur sleuth that solves random crimes. It had to be something very close to her. And so I thought just the whole thing about being married to someone, you know, they're in their early 20s. They don't really know each other. They haven't spent much time together. And then this, her husband has gone through something very traumatic, you know. And the seed for this was actually, and my husband, I warned my husband I was going to mention him, but my father-in-law was part of the 10442nd, and I used to, their motto was go for broke, like just go for it, right? Fight with all your might. And I would buy him all these go for broke books, but one time he said, don't do that anymore, Naomi, it's not nice. And I was like, what? You know, I was mortified. And for him, it wasn't necessarily a celebratory thing, although for sure they, you know, they were the most decorated unit for.
They still are.
For a unit of their size, but because of the actual that he was on the front lines, he had been injured. Well, what were all the injuries he had gone
three
through?
Purple Hearts. He was wounded 3 times.
Silver.
Purple Heart.
He had Silver Star and all this stuff, and he wore a brace for the rest of his life, right? So, so that kind of like opened a door for me because I look at things emotionally,
Mhm.
like, oh, you know, this is something different that we don't really, we know that vets deal with, you know, shell shock or post-traumatic
Yeah.
stress, but we don't really hear it from a Nisei point of view.
No, we don't.
And so I started doing research, like I would talk to someone who deals with veterans. This is like on the QT, do you know of people who are dealing with mental issues?
Yeah.
And she said yes, you know, and they were kind of dealing with it later in life through the Veterans Administration, you know, and I thought, wow, that's really fascinating. And my friend at Densho, which is a website that with Japanese American history, my friend works there, and he's very, he collects weird information, and he said, Naomi, I have a list of crimes that had been committed by Nisei vets. A lot of them actually had been from Hawaii. But it's just more, I mean, I'm not trying to out dirty laundry, but it was more like, of course, if you're a person that has seen that kind of, you know,
Horror.
yeah, that military, you know, destruction, you know, it's gonna, you know, for some people it stays with them.
It does.
So that's why, so there is something that happens to an older man, and Aki suspects there's kind of elder abuse.
Mm.
So, yeah, and from there, and then it's linked to this gentleman who was the best man at her wedding in Chicago. So that she feels like she has to go down that rabbit hole and find out what has really happened. So.
Aki has proved to be a strong person, but she has to develop that, and you write her very well, including all your characters, and I really like how you humanize them with all their faults, but also you don't necessarily know that that's how they are when they're first presented. And if you could talk a little bit about your characters and how you create your characters.
You know, writing Japanese American characters, it's very tricky, and especially a Nisei Japanese American. I know some of you, like Derek, you know a lot of Nisei women, right? I don't know. I find maybe because you're a man, it's different. I think maybe these elders, they had a soft spot for you, but I think for me, a woman dealing with Nisei, you know, it was hard for me to get through and really dig deeper and find, because I mean, a lot of them, they were the ones who were keeping the family together, you know, so there was the strength, and they didn't want to go back in time. They didn't, although there were some women who dealt with depression and those kind of things. But for the most part, like when I worked at the newspaper, there were very tough women who were very into getting things done and not so much about the emotion. But I know that they dealt with things emotionally, especially when they're in their 20s.
Yeah.
So a part of this is just imagining, you know, how it was for them. I've had little hints because there's been people who have had love letters. I haven't read them, and you know, but little things like, oh, like there's romance and darling and all these things, and I wanted to kind of bring that to light.
You did that very well.
Oh,
Yes, thank you. The setting, I have to talk a little bit about the setting, Los Angeles. And I like how you explain about Little Tokyo, because during the war it became mostly African American, and they call it Bronzeville. And then it slow transition back to Little Tokyo. And I was wondering how you did your historical research in recreating these vivid images of communities like the Boyle Heights neighborhood, Little Tokyo.
Well, in terms of Little Tokyo, what was really helpful was actually the paper I used to work at, Rafu Shimpo, is digitized. And I think Gary was saying it's digitized here in Santa Barbara too, right?
UCSB one.
UCSB, so can anybody access that, or do they have to be a student?
No, they will do it for you.
Okay,
Cool.
so that kind of provided, because the newspaper, it started publication in January 1st, 1946. So I kind of followed that because this is set in 1946.
So you read all those papers?
Well, I skimmed them, but
Yeah.
but there's like surprising things that be helpful, like classified ads, you know, and what kind of you know, like they're looking for a gardener, how much were they paying them, what kind of housing. There was crime, you know, that I followed a lot of that kind of thing. That was in other newspapers as well. And then the beauty of Boyle Heights in Little Tokyo, and if you haven't received this postcard, Soho does a wonderful job because they have maps. And Evergreen, so Clark and Division is an intersection in Chicago, and Evergreen refers to a street, Evergreen, in Boyle Heights. Most people know it from the Evergreen Cemetery, which gives you a sense of the multicultural Los Angeles. So some of it was actually just walking, you know, those areas because the buildings are still there, and then reading looking at photographs at the time, and I've also done a lot of oral histories, worked on projects with health providers, so those kind of things all helped.
Speaking of different multicultural neighborhoods, you have African American characters, Japanese American characters, a few Mexican American characters, and they all intermingled, which speaks to what Los Angeles was like in the late 1940s, as opposed to a city like Boston or, you know, segregated areas. And I really wanted to commend you on naturally, organically putting those groups together and how they interacted. And I was wondering if that was a challenge for you to do that. Since you wrote about so many Japanese American characters in your previous work.
Well, because I've worked in Little Tokyo and Los Angeles, it wasn't as difficult. And there was also Charles, the African American character that's in it, is kind of based on a man that I got to know when I was in Little Tokyo. He was living in low income housing there, so he was obviously, you know, of another time. But so a lot of things I just took people I knew. The Latina character, the nurse's aide, that was kind of based on my friend Barbara. You know, she gave me like the nicknames, and she likes to stitch a lot. I don't like to stitch, so it's like I'll put that in there. So a lot of things is actually things that I'm experiencing today, and I just sort of meld that in to the book. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, I'll ask you one more question, then we'll open it up. It's a trilogy, or it's the prequel.
Oh,
but
this is a duology.
Duology, okay.
For right now.
Okay. However, you were only going to write two books originally? Is that?
Clark and Division, I thought it was a standalone.
Okay.
And then my editor, again, you know, was kind of, we need to do a follow-up. And I was thinking, well, I am trying to tell about the resettlement experience, Chicago and then LA, so to me that made sense. So they're kind of bookends.
Okay.
But some places I've talked to, I spoke to Warwick's in San Diego, and someone said, can't you go, you know, forward in time, and Aki's an older person and dealing with the redress movement, you know, and I was going, that was kind of interesting. So maybe that could be something in the future, but right now, these books are kind of dark, so I wanted, that's why with I live in Pasadena, which is like Santa Barbara. It's just gorgeous, right? Which is, thank God, during the pandemic, we had beautiful gardens to walk through. And so I needed a break, and I'm looking at the arts and crafts movement in Pasadena and how it's influenced by Japanese aesthetic. So it's been fun for me just to go to a pretty building and look at and it's set in 1903, and again what I'm trying to do is dig out stories that people don't know. There was a very prominent East Bay artist who was the toast of the town in Pasadena, and nobody knows about him.
Okay.
And so I'm trying to bring him back.
All right, we'll bring him back. But I have to say, before we open up, when I first read Clark and Division, I go, Naomi went dark. In a good way. I was very impressed because you shifted gears, and you've reached a new literary realm, I think, with that. So, don't want to. Questions?
I want to sort of make a statement. So I've been choked up a couple times when we're talking. So you're a California writer, and when you're writing these books, Naomi, they are putting down history. So let's say very briefly, 2 weeks ago I was talking to a young Mexican gardener and explaining who the Japanese gardeners were. And when I was growing up in Salinas, I knew everyone who would pay a bit extra for a Japanese gardener because they were works of art. But look how he knew nothing about this, how quick history could
Oh, yeah,
go,
for sure.
especially in our state. So God bless you for what you're doing.
Yeah, I think my intention, you know, who knows how long these books will last, but at least to document a certain place and time and a certain way people spoke and interacted, you know, that's all I can do. Yeah, thank you.
I have a similar observation and a thank you to you, Naomi. I was 21 years old before I knew anything about the concentration camps and the Japanese American interments. And I was educated in this country. And what your books have done has been to marry fiction with history. And you've just filled in some blanks that a book I just read from Daniel J. Brown about the Nisei War gentleman. Anyway, thank you for filling in things that I wish I'd learned a long, long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, this is all of our histories.
Yeah.
And so many, when I go, in the past when I've done like women who lunch kind of events and encounter older women who are white and they just, there are tears in their eyes and they go, you know, in the 1942, they had a best friend who was Japanese in California and they just disappeared and no one explained it to them. So that kind of, to me, felt like this is not just a story that affects Japanese Americans. It's a larger story. It's a larger American story. Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for the comment.
Nice. Are there any other questions?
What age, what would be the earliest age appropriate to read this? I have teenagers, so I'm just,
Well,
they read a lot of stuff, but.
I think it depends. Okay, so it is dark. I mean, Clark and Division, they've been teaching it. I've been speaking to some private high schools that have taken it up. So I think anything like 16, 17. If it's younger, I would say one of, you know, my.
Depends on the kid, but.
Yeah, ice in parent, like, instead of Hawaii dealing with shave ice, or there's a bicycle cop one, or the gardener. Although for young people, they're not that interested in older people. Unless they're very close to their grandparents. So.
I think they like Aki, the main character.
Thank you.
So we have one more question. So what are you doing now?
Well, I'm doing research on it's
On
called
the-
Crown City.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to just thank everyone for coming, and I guess Ken here, what's your last name?
Ando.
Ando. So Ken Ando actually lived in Los Angeles, right?
Right.
In 1946, came from Tule Lake.
Right.
Right. I guess Jerome, you said, to Tule Lake. Were you in the Little Tokyo area, or were you further?
Actually, there's a lot in that book. I sort of had a preview of it that relates to me. I was born in Boyle Heights
Oh, okay.
at the
Wow.
Memorial Hospital. And then my father actually owned a hotel on 9th and Santee Street.
Okay.
And then
Santee.
the war started, and we were relocated through Santa Ana to Aurora, Arkansas. From Aurora, Arkansas, my father was a no-no, so he was shipped to Tule Lake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Tule Lake, when the war ended, we came back to Los Angeles. And my father was very familiar with the hotel business, so he basically ran a kind of a flop house hotel
Yeah.
at 535 Wall Street,
Yeah.
which is now a police station, by the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that's where I was raised until we moved to West LA.
You
that
probably
nice
saw
area.
quite many things.
Right,
at that.
exactly.
So, I mean, that's what's been very rewarding for me because I encounter people, you know, they say, this is my story. So, yeah, have Ken sign your book too. Because, I mean, that's my intention too, to be kind of a living book. You know, it's not, my intention is like, oh, I'm such a great author, but it's more like opening a door to stories. Yeah, so thank you, Ken, for sharing.
And Naomi, thank you very much for coming to Santa Barbara.
Thank
One
you.
more.
Oh,